newly adopted home of ours to recognize the trauma that we've gone through. And that just hasn't happened. In fact, there's been some success, but we've wasted a lot of time trying to get someone else that has a vested interest in not acknowledging the trauma that they caused to acknowledge it, instead of acknowledging it ourselves and putting our own healing process together. So you see other immigrants that come to America, one of the things they do is they build community. They build their own community, and they've gone through discrimination too. They've gone through oppression once they come to these shores. But because of that culture, it's not even something that they have to think about. Culture inherently unites a people. You don't have these petty arguments over minor philosophical differences because you got this culture that pulls you together. And if you can imagine the exact opposite in the descendants of slaves, you begin to understand this unresolved trauma that we're talking about. Okay, this is a pretty famous picture of a slave that was beaten repeatedly, obviously, and the scar tissue that built up on his back. And you know, some of these pictures that I'm going to show you, they may seem graphic, and I see them as the reality of the culture and the history that we've gone through. One of the strengths of the Jewish people is that they, whether it's taught in schools, whether it's taught through this poisonous media that we have, one of the things that Jewish people do, that Japanese people do, is they teach their children, this is our history, this is what we went through, and don't ever forget it. Because if you forget it, again, here's a slave ship. In this particular case, I forget the name of this ship, but this was a revolt. So part of the purpose of indoctrinating Africans was to make them docile. So one of the things that you won't hear about is the slave revolts that took place throughout history. And I mean, there's nothing wrong, not to advocate violence, but America has gone to war over less justified reasons than the way some people of African descent, Native American descent, Japanese, Chinese, even white immigrants and poor whites were treated. So to fight against oppression is a natural and healthy thing to do. But again, part of America's denial is to downplay a lot of these elements because they don't want us to be fighters. They don't want us to be men. They don't want us to stand up and take charge of our community. And as we get into it later, you'll see some clear examples of that. Okay, again, how could a man, today, you know, one of the things, and John's heard me say this a number of times, that the average for children in America that grow up without regular contact with their fathers is about 35%. In the African American community, it's close to 70%. And people, especially mainstream America, they just shake their heads and say, man, if you black men would just take responsibility for your own lives and your children, your situation would improve. Well, that's true. But you spent 246 years with an institution, the peculiar institution that didn't allow us to be fathers. Because your children, your wife, even though legally we weren't allowed to get married, because legally we weren't considered people. We're considered 3/5 of a human being. That was for 246 years. And then people say, well, you know, slavery ended in 1865. That was a long time ago. The most violent, and you'll see this too, the most violent period of time, I can't say the most violent because there were some serious atrocities that existed during slavery. But this was property. These people were valued property, so you wanted to keep them if you could. Now, if you had somebody that was just off the hook and wouldn't submit, you might lynch them. But the high point in lynching in America was the 75 years after slavery ended, because there was fear, there was hatred, and we were no longer property to be protected and exploited. But how could a man be a man like this? Imagine how many parents are in the room? Okay, imagine your child looking up at you while you're in chains like this. and what would be going through your head? And what kind of psychological adjustments would you have to make to survive and be able to look your child or your wife in the eye, if you could? This was a boy being tortured into submission. About 13 years old. I think that was in North Carolina. And there are these islands, I can't remember the name of them, but off the coast of South Carolina, the slave ships used to land there first in order to send the slaves through this indoctrination period. You were beat if you were caught speaking your native language to somebody else that understood your language. You were beat if you were trying to carry on some of your own ethnic traditions. So in other words, this island was to indoctrinate you to be a good slave. Now, one of the reasons that we don't talk about it, and they don't teach it in institutions like this, is because, well, we don't want to make people mad. We don't want to make black people angry. My brothers and sisters is angry already. And we internalize it to the point where we die 12 years younger than everybody else. In fact, our life expectancy is comparable to many third world countries, and that's tragic for those third world countries, but in the richest nation in the world, where a black man can have the same health care, quality health care, as a white man of similar age and diet, that black man is still likely to die 8 to 12 years younger. And I did this research project when I was in school, and I was looking for predispositions, because I used to be a drug alcohol counselor too. I was looking for a predisposition to chemical dependency. Found none. African Americans aren't more likely to abuse drugs and alcohol than anybody else. But what I did find is the impact of stress. Real or perceived acts of racism produce a chemical reaction in your body. And that chemical reaction repeated over and over and over again leads to hypertension, high blood pressure, heart disease, kidney failure, different forms of cancer, all of which we're #1 in, by the way. And that stress is another hidden, I guess, another area that we don't really look at. And when you imagine poor communities, whether it's black people or on the reservation or in the bayou or barrio or, you know, in Appalachia and poor white communities, that stress takes a toll on people.